everyone, and thank you so very, very much for joining me today for another episode of Talking Cloud. Now, this is where we talk about cloud computing, cloud compliance, all things and anything cloud. I mean, this is such a massive and expansive space. There's lots and lots to talk about. Now, the other thing is I'm no expert, but I do know how to find them. And man, if I got a grandfather of the cloud today, I'm really jazzed. This is someone who I'm proud to be able to call a friend, whom I've also worked very closely with as a colleague. Just a bright, brilliant, very, very terrifically smart guy when it comes to the cloud. And you'll hear why I'm saying that once we dig into this podcast, because the guy blazed some early trails. I mean, this guy's got a long machete, and he was cutting paths with cloud and cloud solutions long before almost all of us. And so it gives me great pleasure. I'm super jazzed to have this conversation today to introduce to you Patrick Pushor. Patrick, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you, Grant. I'm excited. It's in this new world of virtualness. You get your fair share of Zoom meetings, but not your fair share of really nice, deep, fun conversations. So thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. And, full disclosure for the audience. So I've known Patrick since I met Patrick when I joined Dome 9, when I started as the principal evangelist working for Zohar. And in fact, I was super jazzed and excited back then to meet you because I knew you were, in fact, the first North American hire Zohar brought on board at Dome 9. Isn't that right?
Yeah, really close. Anyways, that's right. We had done, lots of really great work already in terms of software development in Israel. We had hired a few folks in North America who wouldn't work out much further, and then I was kind of the most senior one very quickly, and it kind of grew from there.
Tell me, what year was that?
It's all a bit blurry. My start with Dome 9 wasn't actually there when I joined them full time. I was running a blog and a podcast, Speak of the Devil, interviewing cloud leaders. I had started that in about 2012.
I'm a copycat.
And so, no. I mean, hey, it was something I kind of had to do. I found this new thing called cloud in about, 2010 that I got kind of serious with it anyways.
Wow.
And I was in a role that I couldn't really kind of express that side. So I built this blog and learned about lots of things and interviewed, really smart, small cloud startup leaders, and Dome 9 was among them. So I got to know them, and we sort of, bounced ideas back and forth from a technical marketing perspective. And then I guess it was 2014 when I joined them full time.
Definitely in the early days. Now, I know, because I've known Zohar for a number of years, we worked together, as you know, back at Checkpoint. Yeah. And I remember, I want to say like 2010, 11-ish, I remember having a conversation with Zohar, and he was telling me about what I think was the first use case for the product at the time, that dynamic port, the ability to do that. That's dynamic right. Leasing, right? So you could have a webmaster somewhere else and send him a link that would dynamically open up the port for him to go in and do whatever he needed to do, and then
that's exactly right.
Heal up, right? That I think that was the initial use case for Dome 9, right?
It was kind of that automated port flapping, open when you had a need for it, but closed and off to anybody, never mind, a small scope right. when you didn't. And what attracted me to Zohar and Roy and Dome 9 was the fact that, and it was agent based. We made lots of pivots kind of from the original product, but they were thinking about security problems at scale kind of naturally, right? And I think there was an inflection point before I met them and joined them that they said, hey, this public cloud thing is coming. This agent approach isn't really going to work, and we're probably going to have to measure a lot, different things. And so they consciously made a pivot, and I think it was sort of that pivot that attracted me, because I was learning about the same things at the time, and it was just kind of I bugged Zohar until he gave me a chance.
So the pivot was to move away from an agent-based solution and was to one that was essentially API based.
Yeah, that's right. Kind of looking back,
What a
I'm
smart move,
speaking for
huh?
them. I'm speaking, really were. I mean, like you said, Zohar, he started thinking about security at scale at Checkpoint, right? And
Mm-hmm.
did great things there before he ever started
Provider
Dome
one,
9.
yep,
That's
exactly.
exactly right. When I told him about Dome 9 early, my brother had worked with the product, and he said, "Oh, you're working with a guy that actually built this. That's a very cool thing."
Yep.
Everyone knows that product and that platform. So yeah, I think they were always sort of looking at this security at scale problem and realizing they're going to be much bigger problems to solve kind of on the cloud. Let's call it the cloud security plane, and not necessarily kind of in the workload like they were looking at. And they were doing things in the agent like automating the firewall, based on group policy you would set in the SaaS portal, real security at scale kinds of things. But I think they saw the writing on the wall early.
Well, I think one of the hallmarks of a successful, generally, or destined to be successful, you hope, startup is, fail fast, be able to pivot, be able to
Yes.
adjust. And certainly, I think anyone listening would agree agent based as opposed to really exercising the vast, growing, and continually increasing availability of APIs. That's the way to go, right? I mean, when you look at the list of available functions and services and capabilities, having an agent would be virtually impossible to be able
Yeah.
to accommodate everything, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, yes, yet until relatively recently, it was pretty tough to get away from agents in workloads, right?
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, agents don't run in Lambda functions, and agents don't run in a lot of these services we consume from the public cloud naturally. But even where they do, the cloud API coverage is getting good enough that you can sort of do the same things without them. And I
Right.
think this is sort of the next maybe frontier of, because at Dome 9, we refocused away from the host, not exclusively. There were measurements you could do, and make sure that the instances running on AWS were using the correct AMIs. From a cloud control plane, there were things you can do, but from a vulnerabilities in the workload, let's say down to that level, we
Mm-hmm.
didn't focus there, because quite
Mm-hmm.
frankly, that problem had been relatively well solved and executed on, whereas this cloud plane mystery of how are we ever going to know where all these knobs and dials are compared to where they should be,
Right.
they saw that as the greatest opportunity, and
Right.
I think proved themselves very well for sure.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too how things continue to evolve. Now, again, I guess just for full transparency and disclosure, you and I met, and we actually had a short but sweet, I guess you could say, tenure together, working together before you moved on to other things, which I was, bummed to see you go. But I remember you and I were presenting at an Executive Alliance conference in Florida when the Dome 9 acquisition was announced. And we were presenting kind of in tandem, co presenting a presentation we ran with for a while. My CEO told me we had to move our data center to the public cloud. So, what's the big deal? And
That's
I
right.
remember that distinctly because I thought it was such a wonderful volley to have you there because you offered really rich insight that I just didn't have, particularly at that point. It was, 3 months after I had joined. So
That's right.
it
That's
was
right.
pretty early. I quickly realized how much you really were a grandfather of the cloud, and you had a lot of really insightful things. Now, things have changed a lot, Patrick, because I can tell you I didn't really hear a lot about containers or functions, for example, in those early days where it seems like it's so much more now. How how do people keep up with this space, man? I mean, it's just so fast moving. What would you
Yeah.
recommend people do?
Yeah, you're right. Like, the space is fast moving, and then kind of the small container space is really fast moving, especially right now.
Yep.
This week, Google announced that their functional equivalent to Lambda on AWS will run containers. So you'll be charged computationally like Lambda, by the time your code takes to execute. You'll be charged the same way, but you'll be running from standard containers that may already exist. That's how easy it'll be.
Hmm.
So even things as simple as, functions as a service aren't well defined yet, and containers may be a piece of how that all kind of winds up in the long term. So you're right, it's it's tough. I think refactoring your application to make use of all the newest bells and whistles doesn't make sense. So it's it's sort of a matter of fact. If you're building apps on any of the big three, you're leveraging the capabilities they have at the time, hopefully working with the team to know kind of what's on the horizon, if it might make sense for you. But at some point, you draw that line, you build your app, and as new functionality comes out, you learn about it, and I guess you refactor it in as you go. But it is a challenge, you're right, because I might roll my own database today because I have very unique requirements that the as a service offerings don't really allow me to run, and tomorrow that's a sort of a different option. It's a service debuts, and now I have to scratch my head and think, okay, do I want to maintain this database? How much effort has it taken me kind of in the time that I have built it? Should I just use an as a service offering that build it yourself to platform service argument continues even for apps that are very successful? And then add securing all those new things that you don't even understand yet fully understand how to secure. I mean, you can sort of see where that cloud security posture management fit is for sure. And even the smallest organization with the spread that the cloud is just too tempting. Imagine these. You and I spoke the other day about imagine if you had a data center in these COVID times and you had an application that was, as many are, experiencing exponential growth. How would you scale that out? How would you procure enough infrastructure to power that growth? Whereas on the public cloud, it's almost a non-issue from a credit card billing perspective. It's sure an issue, but from a can I make my app respond to this dynamic need that I had no idea was coming? I mean, boy, those that have built on the public cloud, especially in these times, I bet are very thankful.
The thing, I guess, for me that's remarkable, Patrick, is the pace and rate of change and subsequent adoption of new technologies, right? I mean, we've all heard how long it took to get to 1 million televisions, how long it took to get, to 1 million computers, how long. I mean, the scale, the speed when something gets hot, like containers.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's
crazy. And you and I remember a time when enterprise IT acted so much more conservatively than they do now. I mean, visibly, right? And I think that must be the influence of the small, scrappy startup leveraging the public cloud, kind of proving I can go from concept to execution in X amount of time, and the enterprise standing back going, yeah, we need change management, but wow, it's killing us, right? It has to be some sort of happy medium there, because when I started in IT, kind of probably a quarter century ago, right? I couldn't imagine a technology as new as any of this, getting greenlit like this at all.
Oh, it's true. It's true. Although, I had a very interesting conversation. One of the things I'm in the process and hope to launch here fairly soon is another podcast. What I want to talk about is the journey to cybersecurity maturity, and really focus on C-level, CISOs and the like, talking about some of the things that we need to do, right, in order to get to a lower total cost of ownership, in order to really homogenize our environments, so we can move at the speed of cloud, at the speed of DevOps. But the thing he, kind of brought me back to, it's one thing he brought me back to earth. He says, it's one thing to have really cool stuff, but, he says, like, we saw this really cool endpoint solution, and we're doing a bake-off because we're up for a renewal. And they got a good price and good functionality and all of this. It's really great. He said, but I asked him, do you integrate with ServiceNow? No. Okay. Do you integrate with Splunk? No. And quickly, now, albeit it's a large enterprise, but quickly that cool, sexy, slick product starts to lose its luster if it doesn't fit into something that is making my life easier, better, more automated, more efficient. And I'm willing to take a few, less fancy bells and whistles if I can plug it into my infrastructure. I think that I think that's going to be a trend if we're going to be able to keep up and run with the speed of change.
Definitely. And the precedence is there, right? When you buy a new tool for cost optimization or security, definitely the top questions among the ones you ask are, does it fit into my workflow? Does it export into my standard, which is sumo logic? Does it fit, or am I going to have to define new process to even evaluate it? Which is usually a non-starter. And we expect this now with enough connectors and open APIs. This is kind of table stakes. This isn't anything that a vendor should necessarily be proud of.
I want to pull on that thread a little in terms of the APIs, because one of the things that it seems, and I'm asking you because you're the expert, but it seems like the enterprise has been accustomed to really let's call it a common denominator of security services that have been available. And it's a pretty comprehensive list. And it doesn't translate directly over into what's available from the public cloud providers. On the contrary, it's less, right? It's just not as far along. Furthermore, when I, as an enterprise, build a policy that I want to uniformly impose across my environment, it's one thing. When I go up into the cloud and I might be using two different clouds and I want to uniformly impose a policy or compliance, I want to uniformly utilize APIs, that really gets hard because they're not uniformly published and released, right?
Right, or even envisioned or designed. That's right. I mean, we just talked about a real base example where this function as a service works quite differently over the three providers. I'd argue it's one of the biggest differences among them. They all have ideas of sort of workloads, and they all have ideas of security groups, and kind of the network security plane is somewhat standard, but lots of things aren't. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, I think for an organization to tool something themselves that's multi-cloud kind of flies in the face of why we adopt cloud in the first place, right? If I'm a widget maker, my job's to build widgets, not necessarily to operate a data center to run my applications to make widget making more efficient. So, if we're not going to do that, why are we going to write our own tooling for performance monitoring or cost optimization or security? It doesn't make a lot of sense, especially in a market that's arguably, I wouldn't call it mature, but it's maturing quickly with lots of options.
Yep. Tell me if I'm wrong, but the fact that these different cloud providers have, sacred cows, or at least some of them do, right? That results in them releasing different APIs and different solutions. I think it's probably, it's very noticeable around the whole identity access management, with one having Active Directory and the others not, and how they end up ultimately implementing that. But that causes challenges for enterprises that, again, are trying to unify that stuff.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's, I was sort of inferring the need for this kind of shim between how they need to use the cloud and the more than one provider they're using. If they're using one, kind of the opposite concern happens, where if I dive too deep into all the specific functionality there, and for some reason, maybe through an acquisition, something, it becomes less strategic for me to use cloud provider A and I want to move to B, I don't want to be in bed so far in A's technology that I can't, uproot what I've done and implement it on B. So there's kind of these concerns on both sides. One side is, I want to run things in a standard way, and I can't because these three platforms aren't really standard, versus, I don't really want to go that deep because in the future, if I want to go multi-cloud, that'll be tough to do. Yep. So I think there has to be this kind of fine line where, there's a best of breed selection. I think especially if you're an app builder, if you're an IT department that, stands up a web portal and builds content, that's an easier decision, frankly. Mm-hmm. And I see a lot of those moving to Azure, and they're very successful. Mm-hmm. If you're building applications, I think it's a much tougher decision now, partly because of what you said. One of these three providers has a ton of integration support and is kind of the base public cloud provider that everybody integrates with, and the other two aren't.
Yep.
And don't downplay the value of that ecosystem and that support from third-party vendors, right? It's super, super important. And that's, one of a bunch of vectors we look at. But, I just don't think staying so abstract to be away from that vendor lock-in kind of perspective is super useful, because then you just start, you just scratch the surface on each one of these three amazing platforms. Whereas, if you do pick one as a primary, you can get down the path of leveraging, Lambda triggered by another service, kind of building this web of services without really having to application build that much. And that's a really powerful thing.
Oh, the ability to click a couple of buttons and have this whole thing take off for you is remarkable, right? I mean, this whole ability to orchestrate the automation. You're intimately familiar with things like cloud bots and what that project has kind of grown to become. Exciting stuff. But, I still have naysayers, Patrick. I hear, I've talked to people that say, it'll never happen, that automation will never materialize, that we're never going to auto remediate.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, boy, you're right. We've heard and we hear that a lot. But yet, I think kind of when you take a step back, it does make a lot of sense, because we're just getting to the point now where we have tooling. I won't even say we have process yet. Let's say we have tooling that can sort of measure that breadth of let's call it the security control fabric of any one of these three providers, or more than one of these three providers, in a meaningful way. We're just getting there now. Yeah. So I think those statements are fueled with, I have no hope. How is this ever going to actually work? Whereas, the first wave of cloud security sort of posture management tools sort of prove that, no, we can write a bunch of rules, whether they're attached to compliance standards, if you're kind of, officially sort of governed by standards, or whether you want to write rules that make sense for your own organization, right? These tools now, I think, are mature enough where the value is kind of obviously there. And the answer to that question, you can keep your eyes kind of on all the controls that you need to.
There is an unbelievable number of new, innovative, slick products that are either coming out, or you're hearing them getting announced. I mean, I was talking to somebody about the enormity of the cloud, and despite all these new companies, it's kind of like the internet. For 5 or 10 years, it's still very early in shaping, and you could even argue still is. And yes, the cloud is very much like that. But the pace is so remarkable. It's mind-boggling to see how fast it's going. So I have to ask, because I have a great deal of respect for you, Patrick. I just also really regard very highly your knowledge and understanding of this whole space in the cloud. And so what I'd like to ask you to share is maybe your ideas, your thoughts for those that are not yet fully in, or they're getting ready to go in, or at some various, let's call it, earlier stage of that launch into the cloud. Or maybe they're in the cloud but not really at full stride. I'm wondering, what three things, should they really focus on? Should they really make sure that they get right, that they don't do? Just, what three tips would you give? But before you answer, I need to keep the lights on, so I'm going to pay the bills. I'll be right back.
How well are you protected in the cloud? How fast do you move when the cloud moves at the speed of DevOps? And do you have the confidence you see everything you need to see, good or bad? Checkpoint Software. Cloud with confidence. See it, control it, secure it.
Okay, Patrick, what do you think? Give me three things that you just give as key recommendations for my listeners, our listeners.
Sure, and I think, how well you might already know these three things kind of depends where on that continuum you are. If you're sort of just still theoretically sort of researching the cloud, you're sort of on one side of this continuum. If you've already got a handful of workloads in, which is probably the more realistic case, you've already done a test, a POC, something, you recognize the value, and now you go, what do I do? I think the first thing is be wary of those vendors that you use in the data center now that say they've got you covered in the public cloud. Ask them how, and ask them how they intend to go from measuring, base level things about your environment to, AWS's 170 services. And of course, no product measures them all, but that's the goal of sort of the cloud security posture management vertical, if you will, is to support as many services as their customers need them to, and to compose meaningful measurements of those services so you know where you are. It's not all you need, right? There's still some more traditional things we need in our security toolbox, but that has now become absolutely one of those essential things. So just be wary of vendors, solutions, even things that maybe your champions within your organization want to bring from a process or tooling perspective from your data center. Just vet them and make sure they belong. You don't want to start your effort with a bunch of technical debt, right? Maybe, for example, if you've got a vulnerability management, intra-workload vulnerability management solution that's agent-driven, just approach those things with caution if you need it. And if it's licensed and it's the most affordable thing, great. But just have that in the back of your mind that the cloud provides, ways to do similar things with much more efficiency and often with much more capability as well, through that API coverage. So that's probably the first thing.
And be wary of the lift and shift promise, I would say, right? I mean, the vendors that have, they go a little too far on, no problem. You can just move it up there and you're all set.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I approach that from a vendor tooling perspective, but you're right. I mean, everything, the tendency will be to lift and shift, and then you'll sort of make that commitment to say, and then I'll leverage the platform capabilities better. And we know, we know what happens with those best intentions when the world heats up, right? So, bite the bullet, do it. Make sure you've got some sort of security solution on the way in, whether that's, and often it is kind of the internal alarms you can set up within each provider. That's often how you start, if you even start there. But do something on the way in, and stick to that policy. Try to get some governance wrapped around this beast, because I tell you, when those people with ideas realize how quickly they can go from idea to, I can do something about it, rather than having this massive procurement cycle in front of an idea, it just blossoms. This as well as I do. So get ready. Yeah. Get ready for that floodgate.
Yeah, that's right.
I was on a Gartner briefing actually this morning, and I'm surprised to still hear so much about a skill shortage. Finding, qualified, certified, and experienced people to lead your cloud efforts is challenging. Yep. I wouldn't take that for granted. Often it takes a long time to find the right resources, especially of any sort of initiative at scale, right? Yep. At Dome9, we would meet companies with new initiatives. We'd meet new digital banks, for example, who had really, really great technical plans, and they would underestimate what it took to power them.
Yep.
And we saw it time and time again. So that skill shortage, I mean, it's not a technical thing, but it's important. And it came up today, and I thought, boy, I kind of thought we were over that. I figured your average kind of sysadmin or IT architect would have seen the writing on the wall and at least kind of prepared themselves for what's about to happen and captured the opportunity. Let's be frank, if you're somebody in IT who knows both the old way of doing it and the new way of doing it, you're really valuable. Right. So I think that's really key as well.
Yeah. And I think that's great stuff. I guess what I think about is those admins, those network guys, those security guys, those on-prem guys and gals. They're all drinking from a fire hose, and we're saying, hey, we got a better drink, and that's one of the, I think, problems is everybody is busier than a three-headed cat at a bird show. Stopping and God forbid someone would RTFM, right? I mean, we don't. But I think that has consequences, and the excessive use of the same terms with things like eyes and elastics, like an elastic load balancer. Right. Well, every network manager says, I worked with F5's load balancer for years. That's no problem. And they let their hair down and oversimplify it.
That's right. And I lived that. I worked with the startup I guess back in about 2011 before Dome 9 that, clearly moving what we were doing as a service provider, we were kind of a niche technology learning classroom provider that was powered by VMs, but powered by VMs in a data center. And moving that to the public cloud made drop dead easy financial sense. There was a technical path forward, and they just couldn't do it, for lots of those reasons, for sure. And very understandable then, far less understandable now. And that's, I think, why I was surprised to hear that it was still something that was a reality and that people had to know.
Yeah, and it's gonna continue. In fact, more specifically as it relates to cybersecurity resources, it's horrible. It's horrible. Yeah. And what's happening is, the demand is increasing at a much higher compound annual rate than the colleges, universities, trade schools are producing to fill the need already. So the gap's widening, which just translates to the bad guys get another advantage. I mean, as it is, we all know we have to be right every time. They only have to be right once, right? We've all heard that. So
yeah, that's very true. And I think if I had to think of that third piece of advice for somebody dipping their toe in the public cloud is, it's a platform for a reason. It's fine to sort of run all of your services in virtual machines to start, but I think even moving to the cloud, takes, for me at least, the successful migrations I have seen, and I mean migrations of an IT department, not a migration of an application. Right. I mean a wholesale. We're going to adopt this.
We're moving into the cloud.
Yeah, this thing that we once called just someone else's computer, we now see the power. We now understand the sort of platform instant on nature of this, and we're taking it seriously. That's getting there. I think it's a challenge, and I think it really has to do with kind of the use case for the migration. The projects that I have seen, and most of this experience I think comes from Dome 9. We had the pleasure of working with, initially kind of a smaller, maybe developer-centric kind of organization. Some startups themselves definitely saw value in Dome 9 early. And then as we adapted the product, certainly more of an enterprise appeal. And I think those enterprise customers who found the biggest challenge in sort of adopting the mindset of the cloud, never mind the technology, the way they were successful was, an initial project where they could, make a difference. And it was mostly in AWS at the time because it was early. Make a difference there, consuming some of those services rather than bringing virtual machines over part and parcel as they were in the data center and standing that up. I've seen that too. The value kind of seen from that kind of solution when you have power on VMs and they stay on for perpetuity and they do the same thing that you did in your data center. That was where I found kind of the most migration of the mindset of IT in general kind of stop, because the value, quite frankly, isn't there. VMs are VMs, and it might seem a little bit cheaper on paper, but as your applications grow and they need an additional core and additional memory, VM for VM, I'm not sure the public cloud is all that of an interesting use case or all that of a cost optimized use case, right? So I think the successful POC into the public cloud takes a look at an application that you might run in your data center, maybe a very standard web application that's got a database tier, a web tier, maybe some static content somewhere, and it's refactored, maybe only slightly, right, to leverage maybe storage as a service, right? Block storage from AWS, leveraged maybe, to house data in a database that you don't have to, maintain the OS and patch anymore, right? That's where I think the biggest kind of successful migration wins come from, because I think it's the easiest to demonstrate the value difference for sure.
And then if that web server happens to be one that has a store and you introduce a new product that becomes the rave and goes viral, it'll be able to scale and accommodate that demand, where you'd be up against some real challenges to try to accommodate that, right? I mean, that's the other side that you can clearly demonstrate when you move into the cloud.
Well, that's right. And unfortunately, we have to think about kind of the reverse situation in these times, right? Where you have a service that maybe isn't nearly as in demand as it once was, kind of in these post-COVID times. The opposite's true as well, right? If your app is architected properly, you can make use of the sort of scale down, pay only for what you use phenomenon as well. And that's equally as important. Rapid innovation, absolutely. But I was watching the Twitter feed of someone that I respect. His name is Joe Emerson, and he's once a cloud guy, now moved on to sort of implement cloud in a very sort of traditional business. He does it with insurance, and he was kind of quoting figures that it took. I served this many insurance customers last year for this much money on AWS, and had a slight breakdown, and it was absolutely amazing.
Wow!
I urge everyone to go take a look at it. His name is Joe Emerson, and I believe
spell that
it's
Joe.
I probably couldn't.
Like Emerson? Emerson?
Yeah, Emisson, perhaps.
Okay.
It's called Branch Insurance.
Branch Insurance. Okay.
I'll throw a plug out there for him and what he's doing. But he's a very smart guy, and he has led a team to architect a solution that clearly takes, to get numbers like that, it clearly makes use of scale up and scale down economics, which is, not something you get to in your first kick at AWS. It truly isn't. But you'll never get there if you don't bite the bullet and say, I'm here because of the platform nature. Let me leverage at least part of it.
Yeah. And it is a mistake, I think, for people to think I'm going to save money by moving everything up into the cloud, because that's, as you said, if I got a VM running here or a VM running there, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The value really comes into play when you exercise the attributes available only in the cloud, the ephemeral aspects, the dynamic, agile aspects. Those are the real values that you've got to posture yourself to take advantage of. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And I think, there's one stage of value. And as you keep looking down the chain of, geez, can I operate this with the same kind of level of service, the same SLIs to my either internal or external stakeholders, and reduce my costs? Then it takes knowledge. Then it takes some really deep experience of knowing about, reserved instances and how I can architect an application kind of around that, where almost the app speaks the language of the cloud provider via API and scales itself. Right. That's what we're getting to.
Yeah.
We're not there quite yet, but imagine that future where the scale just sort of happens.
Yeah. It's exciting. I love, I'm an old man now. I was a young man when I got into this business. It still is something, frankly, Patrick, I pinch myself because, I think, as I've told you, in my very early 20s selling fishing tackle and knives for a wholesale distributor, and I didn't fish and didn't carry a knife, and we bought a computer, and then in 1983 helped open up an Apple dealership, and it's been the most remarkable ride. And what I love is, and I've said this for many years, no matter when you get into it, this industry that is, no matter when you get into it, you're getting in at the beginning of something. And that's what also makes it just so exciting, whether it's, getting into virtualization back when that kind of went about, or now the cloud and zero trust and all these. I mean, it's really, really, it's exciting. I've told this to my wife and my kids quite a bit recently. There's one thing that can be the mother of invention, and we all know it, right? It's necessity. And that's been imposed on us in a rather abrupt manner recently.
That's right.
But it's been cool to see how people have stepped up, not for this podcast, but I'll just throw it out there. I think an interesting discussion would be, how much memory should our lives have, right? And what I mean is, how it was before, right? I think of a big, thick, fat rubber band that you put your hands into and you stretch it apart and then you let go, and that got almost 100% memory, right? Right back to how it was. Is that how our life is going to be?
Right.
Or are we going to see there's a balance here that may actually end up being a positive thing in many regards?
I agree, and at least manage that expectation of if that rubber band doesn't bounce back to be entirely the same way, it's okay.
It is okay.
We'll be all right.
And moreover, maybe we'll even be smarter. And this, again, is far off of the cloud, but when you start looking at things like supply chain and how it's been disrupted and where our dependencies are, as in your country, my country, the citizens around the globe, I think a lot of people are doing some heavy-duty soul-searching because we're starting to realize we don't want to be in this situation again.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, imagine the contingencies that got blown out of the water and that are now being rethought about, mostly probably from a personal perspective. I think all of us had thought about the technology side of this, but boy, when everyone goes home and no one's in the office anymore, things become challenging.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Well, Patrick, this is so cool. I love talking with you. I appreciate you a bunch. I hope we can have you back again. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate you spending so much time with me today. So thanks for joining me on Talking Cloud.
Thank you, buddy. I had a great time. I'd love to come back. Thank you so much.
We'll have you back, man. So, hey, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very, very much. I hope you've enjoyed the program today. Tell all your friends, subscribe, share, and thanks again for joining me on Talking Cloud. Have a great day.